Anti-vaping ads are some of the worst campaigns in public health history. Between cherry-picking research, using misleading information, being horrifically cringy, and more, these ads may be the worst attempt at getting kids to stop the one thing they don't want them to do. There's a lot to unpack regarding the sketchiness this propaganda takes part in, so why not start by meeting the two biggest organizations that are in the fight against vaping. Those would be the Truth Initiative and The Real Cost. Now, I'm assuming most of you have seen at least one of their anti-vaping ads on YouTube, TV, or elsewhere, considering they have hundreds of millions of views. But these orgs weren't always this popular. We'll talk about The Real Cost later in this video, considering they weren't started until 2014. But Truth has been around much longer, 25 years to be exact, when they began in 1999 as a non-profit trying to lower cigarette use among teens. Now, unlike most startups, Truth was flush with cash from the beginning. The year Truth started, the nation's 4 largest tobacco companies were ordered to pay American Legacy Foundation, the organization behind Truth, $1.5 billion due to a massive civil lawsuit called the MSA. And on top of that, American Legacy collected another $96 million from smokeless tobacco companies and raised money on their own, resulting in a gigantic war chest for their fight against cigs. And better yet, unlike their ads today, American Legacy had some really effective commercials for convincing kids not to smoke. Arguably, one of the most famous anti-smoking campaigns in history was done by American Legacy in 1999, simply called Truth. The campaign was started in Florida and included 33 hard-hitting commercials that targeted the tobacco industry, portraying them as predatory, money-hungry, and manipulative. For example, this commercial called Body Bag featured young people piling bags of dead bodies outside the headquarters of Philip Morris as a graphic reminder of how many people die from cigarettes every day. This commercial and many more were hated by the tobacco industry because, well, simply put, they were making a lot of money from teenagers, and these commercials were getting rid of their customers. At the time, 1 in 5 teenagers smoked, which of course was great for the industry. But American Legacy was successfully lowering those numbers through their campaign, and not just by a little. When Truth launched across the country in 2000, it contributed to a 40% and 18% decline in cigarette use among middle and high school students. And during the early 2000s, tens of millions of teens quit smoking thanks to American Legacy. Now, in a rational world, American Legacy would celebrate this victory and continue its anti-smoking work, right? Well, they didn't, and instead fully pivoted toward taking down a new enemy: e-cigarettes. Their war against e-cigs ignited in late 2018 when Altria, the makers of Marlboro, bought a 35% stake in Juul due to how popular the brand was becoming, mainly among young people. Because more teens were now vaping instead of smoking, American Legacy deemed Juul, and vaping overall, to be their new public enemy number 1. More specifically, it was Robin Koval, the then CEO of American Legacy, who believed that it was in the nonprofit's best interest to start making anti-vape propaganda. And she didn't just slightly adjust their agenda. She pulled a complete 180. According to a Legacy board member who wanted to remain anonymous, Robin did a total makeover. She changed the name, she changed the staffing, she changed the location, she changed everything. And so American Legacy, which was now rebranded to Truth Initiative, was putting 100% of its efforts towards fighting vapes under Robin's authority. Now, this move was praised by some of Robin's fellow board members, but many others felt that it was questionable and suspicious, and for good reason too. The main thing that sounded alarm bells for these members was the massive culture shift within the organization. According to them, there was a lot less emphasis on well-rounded research being used for their campaigns and more on promoting some sort of agenda from Robin. And this belief has a lot of merit to it. Schroeder Institute, which had done independent research for Truth, was absorbed into a program evaluation unit at the org. And after this happened, it was almost as if Truth denied any research that suggested vaping could be beneficial in some way. Researchers at Schroeder, who argued that vaping could become a pathway out of smoking, were muzzled and edited. And instead, Truth wanted to use research that exaggerated the dangers of e-cigarettes while downplaying any evidence that vaping had slowed down smoking among teens and adults. This obviously upset many of the researchers who had opposing opinions toward what Truth was now believing in, resulting in many of them leaving the organization and speaking publicly against them. For example, David Abrams, a professor of public health at New York University and previous director of research at Truth, said, "They have spun and ignored the science to cherry-pick pick only information and data that supports the ideology of prohibition. They have missed the opportunity of a century to destroy lethal, combustible cigarettes. On top of that, another longtime tobacco control expert who knows all of the players at Truth stated, "The advocates have taken over the scientists." Regardless, by 2020, Truth Initiative and also The Real Cost were ready to dedicate billions of dollars toward taking on the youth vaping epidemic. But it seems like their efforts have been lackluster at best. Actually, as a matter of fact, it's been worse than lackluster. From promoting misinformation to not being effective at all, the anti-vaping ads that have come from Truth and The Real Cost have been downright terrible. But before we get into that stuff, we must state the obvious. These ads are cringy and annoying. You can pick almost any commercial or social media post from Truth or The Real Cost and find something to hate about it. Whether using outdated memes, puppets, awkward actors, or CGI metal monsters, it's clear that these organizations are severely out of touch with the audience they're trying to reach, and the audience's reaction proves it. Wherever you look on the internet, you'll find the general consensus toward these ads is that they're cringy, awkward, and don't resonate at all. For example, here are some comments about Truth's ads. Can we just take a second to talk about how annoying the Truth ads are? They are seriously the stupidest, most ridiculous commercials ever made and should be banned themselves. With their fake influencers, low quality TikToks, even by TikTok standards, shitty dubstep background music, and overall swing and miss attempts at making it look cool to not smoke or vape, I would rather have lung cancer than see another commercial from them. And it's the same conversation happening with The Real Cost. As a high schooler who knows people addicted to nicotine, it's a bunch of bullshit. The nicotine possesses you, or the huge metal monster going into your lungs does absolutely nothing. Been on a YouTube binge today, and holy crap, every ad has been The Real Cost. I'm pretty positive The Real Cost has no idea what it is talking about when it comes to nicotine addiction. Instead of ads advocating for harm reduction and explaining the real, unexaggerated facts, we get ads that frame it as something so serious it's hard for teens not to laugh at. From these comments and countless more, it's clear as day that the kids and teenagers these ads are trying to target despise how these orgs are presenting nicotine addiction. However, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Attempting to manufacture a cool image to stop teens from vaping is one thing, but blatantly lying to your audience is another. And according to multiple examples found by researchers, Truth Initiative is doing precisely that. There's sort of a pattern among the propaganda they've put out. They draw questionable conclusions from scientific research to attack vaping and ignore evidence to the contrary. They put out kind of half-truth statements, like in this article where they threaten the viewer by saying a Juul pod contains as much nicotine as 20 cigarettes, even though each pod is meant to provide many cigarettes worth of vaping time. And also this one, where they scare the audience with this claim.
No one knows the long-term effects of juuling, so any human who uses one is being used as a lab rat.
Now the statement is true, but those long-term effects, whatever they are, will most certainly be better than the long-term effects of smoking. For instance, the Royal College of Physicians has found that the hazard to health arising from long-term vaping is, quote, unlikely to exceed 5% of the harm from smoking tobacco. And there's also this one, where they urge that vaping is a gateway to smoking. Young people who have ever used e-cigarettes had 7 times higher odds of becoming smokers 1 year later compared with those who had never vaped, it says. But another study found that vaping likely diverts more young people from smoking than encourages them to smoke. The same study also notes that smoking among young people has declined at its fastest rate ever during the explosive rise of vaping, making the gateway claim highly unlikely. However, Truth's half-truths get much worse than this. Midway through 2020, as the COVID pandemic spread, Truth published an unsettling warning about e-cigarettes. They claimed that there was growing evidence vaping can harm lung health and put users at a greater risk of contracting COVID-19. Those who have ever used e-cigarettes are 5 times more likely to contract COVID-19 than those who do not use tobacco products, according to a recent study. Now, this article caught on like wildfire, resulting in tons of other media outlets publishing stories based on these claims. But the claims weren't entirely true. The COVID study was challenged by many respected tobacco control experts, including David Abrams, Michael Cummings, and more, who said it relied on impulsive, self-reported data that defied common sense. The sensational claim that vaping increases COVID-19 risk for youth and young adults was based on the data, which is seriously flawed. Unreliable papers like this one have no place in scientific literature. The group urged the journal editor to retract this flawed and misleading paper, but while they didn't, the authors conceded that, quote, "Our study does not imply causality," which basically means that there's no cause and effect relationship between vaping and COVID-19. However, their impulsive claim about vaping and COVID isn't even the worst of the misleading information they've put out. As some of you may know, the COVID pandemic spawned a wave of concern about depression and anxiety among young people, mainly because they were isolated from friends. But to capitalize on this concern, Truth Initiative declared that vaping was making matters worse. In an elaborate campaign featuring national TV ads, a Times Square billboard, and more, Truth created a fake company called Depression Stick. The company sold fictional vapes in flavors like citrus sadness and disappointment and ran commercials asking, "Why be happy when you can be sad?" The commercials claim that vaping can make your mental health worse.
Vaping nicotine can amplify feelings of depression and anxiety.
Now, was vaping making young people's mental health worse, as Truth claimed? Well, scientists aren't so sure. According to research, the relationship between nicotine and mental illness is inconclusive. For example, a systematic review of 148 studies on the topic reported, quote, "inconsistent findings regarding whether nicotine leads to depression and anxiety." A more recent review found that e-cigarette use is associated with mental health issues, but only in the short term. The researchers noted that directionality remained uncertain because more long-term tests were needed to better understand the long-term mental health effects of using e-cigs and to prove there aren't any other factors involved. On top of that, Caitlin Notley, a professor of addiction studies at the University of East Anglia in the UK, pointed out that teen vaping fell during the pandemic while mental health issues rose, inherently making it unlikely that vaping contributes to depression or anxiety. She was troubled by Truth's messaging.
Well, to my mind, this is really dangerous. It is scaremongering, and this is not a campaign based on research evidence, but is, in fact, driven by fear. It is scapegoating the behaviour rather than dealing with the very real and deeply concerning issue of poor youth mental health.
Between the misinformation and horrible delivery, you would think that Truth and the real cost would realize that teens aren't going to listen to what they have to say about vaping. They surely wouldn't give up vaping if they already were doing it, or listen to these ads if they weren't. Right? Well, it seems like that is right. A study from the CDC revealed that between 2020 and 2022, e-cigarette sales increased by more than 46%, and it wasn't just adults buying. An additional survey from the FDA and CDC showed that e-cig use among high schoolers remained steady between 2021 and 2023, hovering around 11.7% on average. And even worse, e-cig use among middle schoolers increased during those same years, from 2.8% to 4.6%. So clearly, these anti-vaping ads aren't working at all. And I also think it's clear why. Teens inherently aren't going to listen to strangers telling them what to do, let alone in a cringy, untruthful way. Adolescents highly value independence at a time when they don't have much of it. So showing them these horrific ads telling them what to do wasn't going to work from the get-go. Instead, I think Truth and the Real Cost would be better off showing personal, true stories about teens struggling with nicotine addiction or some other problems as a result of vaping. For instance, I'll never forget this ad from the CDC showing the real personal story of Terry Hall, a woman who smoked for the majority of her life and had to talk through her neck as a result. Or just another thought, the organizations could embrace vaping as they do in the UK, where e-cigarettes are advertised as a life-saving alternative to smoking. Regardless, it's evident that Truth and the Real Cost are out of touch with their audience, and if they continue to run the anti-vaping ads they have been, I bet they won't reach their goals anytime soon.